Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ibian Rivera. I am a grant manager in the Small Communities Technical Assistance Unit. So I have the task of welcoming you to our second training in our training for the TA Providers series. Last year, we sent surveys to the TA providers and to Drinking Water and Clean Water State Revolving Fund project managers asking for their input on what kinds of training should be provided. Responses from both surveys were reviewed and incorporated into this training series. We hope today's training presentation will give you the information needed to prepare a complete and quality environmental package. So please note, our meeting is being recorded and everyone is on mute. Questions will be taken at intervals noted in the presentation. To ask a question, we ask that you raise your hand. To find the raise your hand icon, please look for the participant icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen. The raise hand feature is located at the bottom right corner of the participant window. If you can, please try finding and clicking the raise hand button now. We will unmute you. We will unmute those asking questions and then mute you once your question has been answered. If you do not have a mic or would prefer to email your question, please send them to ibian.rivera@waterboards.ca.gov to have answered at the end of the presentation. Our presenter today is Gabriel Edwards, an environmental scientist in the Environmental Review Unit in the Division of Financial Assistance. Let's go ahead and get started. Gabriel, are you ready?
I think so. Let me share my screen here. Can you see the presentation?
Not yet.
Not yet. All right, hold on. Share.
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. Okay. All right, well, hello everyone. My name is Gabriel. Welcome to this training on the State Revolving Fund environmental packages. So this presentation will cover the environmental portions of the Drinking Water and Clean Water State Revolving Fund applications. So I'm going to quickly go over the plan for today. We're going to cover the State Water Board environmental context and some resources. We're going to talk about general recommendations for TA providers regarding environmental processes. Then we'll jump into the environmental package. We'll talk about what the environmental packages are, the different types, where to find them. We're going to start with the planning environmental package. This is going to be a fairly short part of the presentation. Comparatively, it's a lot simpler than the construction environmental package. And then we'll move on to the construction environmental package. I'll outline the agenda for this part of the presentation when we get to it, but we'll be taking some time during this section to discuss the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, as well as like the federal environmental crosscutters that are required for a construction application. Please ask questions. This is a fairly long presentation and there's a lot of nuances that are going to be missed in order to get through everything today. I'm not going to be going through every single item in the environmental packages. So if there's a specific piece that you have questions about, please ask. We're going to take some time to respond to questions in a couple places after the presentation on the planning environmental package, after our CEQA discussion, and then at the end of the presentation, we're going to open up for questions on anything related to environmental. So during those times, please raise your hand. Ibian will unmute you, or you can email your questions in and we can go through them at the end of the presentation. Okay, so my name is Gabriel Edwards. As mentioned, I'm an environmental scientist at the State Water Resources Control Board Division of Financial Assistance. I work in the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund environmental unit under Bridget Binning, who's my supervisor. Brian Carey is the supervisor for the Clean Water SRF environmental unit. Generally, Bridget's staff work primarily on drinking water projects and Brian's staff work primarily on clean water projects. And then Wendy Pierce and Lisa Machado are our cultural contacts. Wendy is the supervisor for the special projects unit and Lisa is our senior cultural resources officer. So A note on contacting us: if you have project-specific environmental questions, work with your grant manager to get in touch with the appropriate environmental unit and have like an environmental scientist assigned to take a look at the project. For general environmental questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We're happy to answer questions and respond. A couple of general notes also, email's just better right now. We're working remotely for the most part, and it's easier to respond to and keep track of. If you have questions about a specific project, again, please, at a minimum, CC the grant manager so that they're kept in the loop on the project status and what's going on. The link at the bottom of this slide is to the DFA environmental section website, which I will show here. So this website has information about the specific environmental requirements for the drinking water and clean water SRF programs. It has links to basic CEQA information and some of the same contact information down at the bottom. I'll be referring to this website a few times throughout the presentation. Okay, to start, here are some just general recommendations for TA providers. Number one is coordinate. You don't need to know the details or all the details about the environmental documents, but generally knowing the status of each document and kind of being involved in the process, help keeping track of action items, it's really helpful to keep a project moving. So the most successful TA projects that we have, they have frequent communication between consultants, providers, and state water board staff. If you or the environmental consultant have questions about the environmental requirements, contact the grant manager, get an environmental scientist to help clarify or review the project. There's a lot of strange requirements or weird nuances in the environmental process that we have, and we'd rather catch issues sooner rather than later. Number two, if there's an environmental consultant working on the project, it really may be helpful to have them fill out the environmental package. And this is especially true for construction. The environmental consultant should be familiar with the environmental impacts of the project, as well as the information requested in the environmental package. So we've had a lot of success when the consultant fills out the package since they're already familiar with the information. Okay, let's talk about the environmental packages. The environmental package, along with the required attachments, basically includes all the environmental information and documentation needed for a complete state revolving fund application. So there's two types of environmental packages: planning and construction. Although right now planning is only used in the drinking water state revolving fund program, the construction package is shared by both programs. So it's identical between the drinking water SRF and the clean water SRF. The links here at the bottom go to the forms and instructions web pages for each program. These include links to download the environmental packages if you're trying to find them. So we're going to talk about the environmental package for planning first, since it's relatively simple. Generally, for a planning application, only 3 items are needed for the environmental package to be considered complete. Number 1 is the completed planning environmental package form itself. Number 2 is a notice of exemption, or NOE, or a CEQA document that covers the planning project. And then number 3 is a project map if one is available. Note that the CEQA document or a notice of exemption is for the planning project itself, not the eventual construction project. Most planning projects, especially like in the drinking water SRF program, are exempt from CEQA. And kind of a terminology note, when we say a complete environmental package, generally we are referring to the environmental package form itself, as well as any of these required attachments. So the first several pages of each environmental package contain instructions about how to complete each section. For planning, this is just the first 2 pages. Generally, if you have questions about how to fill out a section, refer to these instructions, and they should either answer your question or at least point you in the right direction. So the main goal of the planning environmental package is to gather as much environmental information about the planning project as possible. If there are details that are known about the construction project, like for example, the location of the construction project, this is helpful to include. But if any answers are not known or you're unsure about the response, please write that in the explain sections at the bottom of the page. So I've skipped the first 2 pages of instructions here, but these are a couple screenshots showing the planning environmental package sections that have to be completed. There's 2 main sections. The first is CEQA status for the planning project. So if a CEQA document covers the planning project or if a notice of exemption is required. Note that any CEQA documents or notices, including notices of exemption, must be circulated or posted at the Office of Planning and Research State Clearinghouse. And also, if the applicant is a private entity, the State Water Board might be the CEQA lead agency. If this is the case, a notice of exemption will not be submitted with the environmental package. We have our own templates for NOEs, so that won't be included as part of the application. And then the second section is to gather general information about groundbreaking for the planning project. So what permits are required and just other environmental information. These are the last 2 pages. Some more questions about the project on the left and a checklist of attachments on the right. Again, if any of these are unknown, please write that in the explain box at the bottom of the page. If the applicant is not a California public agency, so if they're private, they cannot be the CEQA lead agency. So if a CEQA lead agency has not been identified for a planning project, please contact the State Water Board. Often the State Water Board will be CEQA lead agency in these cases. And as I mentioned, if the State Water Board is CEQA lead, no notice of exemption needs to be submitted. We have our own templates and we will take care of filing the NOE. Okay, that was pretty fast. I want to take just a couple minutes to see if there are questions about the environmental package for planning specifically. We're going to go over CEQA processes and filing and that kind of stuff later. But if anyone has anything specific about the environmental package for planning, please raise your hand and we'll try to address that now.
No questions at this time.
Okay, sounds great. All right, let's move on then, and we'll have more time for questions and stuff later. So we're gonna move on to the environmental package for construction now. So this slide is an overview of the main documents that are required for the majority of construction applications, or the average construction application. We're gonna go over each of these attachments as we go through the environmental package for construction. So we need the environmental package form itself, the NOE or CEQA document for the construction project this time, with the same filing or circulation requirements, state clearinghouse, county clerk. We need an environmental alternative analysis unless the project is CEQA exempt, a biological report, culture report, an air quality analysis, and an official floodplain map. So just like the planning environmental package, instructions are included here. In this case, the first 14 pages are instructions. And then once you get to the environmental package form that needs to be filled out, there's 5 main sections: general info, CEQA status, exemption info, federal coordination, and attachments. So here's the plan for going through the environmental package for construction today. We're gonna go through the first 3 sections covering general information and the CEQA process. And then we're gonna have a section on just CEQA documents, process, and the State Water Board as lead agency. Then we'll have a little bit of time for questions just related to CEQA if people have general CEQA questions. We'll come back to the environmental package and we'll go through section 4. This addresses federal crosscutters. We'll be focusing on some specific federal crosscutters here and discussing the required attachments for them. And then we'll end with section 5, which is the attachments to the environmental package. So section 1, general information. This is a short section. There's only 2 main points I want to make here because the rest is pretty self-explanatory. Number 1 is the project title. This needs to match the environmental documents and the rest of the application. Technical reports, CEQA documents, authorizing resolution, etc. Everything should use the same project title. Otherwise, we have to jump through some hoops down the road to get the titles to match, and it can be a bit of a hassle. And then number 2 is the environmental contact person. This is the point of contact at the applicant or consultant. Basically, who should we at the State Water Board contact if we have environmental questions about the project, not the point of contact at the State Water Board. So for example, my name should not be put on this section of the environmental package. Okay, section 2 is CEQA status. Like the planning package, this section just outlines the CEQA status for the project. Who is the CEQA lead agency? Is the project exempt? If not, what type of CEQA document is being prepared, etc. For environmental document status, just put the current status of the CEQA document, like has it not started yet? Is it in progress? Has it been completed? And then again, a note on circulation requirements. CEQA documents must be circulated through the state clearinghouse. We're going to discuss that in a little bit more detail when we go over the CEQA process. The rest of this CEQA status section is just related to the project setting. This is one of the reasons why I recommend that the environmental consultant fill out the environmental package, since they should be familiar with most of this information from the CEQA process. And again, yes answers can be referred to a specific technical report. So for example, if some of the answers in this checklist can be answered by the biological report, that's fine. Just explain this at the bottom of the checklist. Section 3 is CEQA Exemption Information. This is also a pretty straightforward section. Section 3 only needs to be completed if the project is CEQA exempt. It basically just identifies what exemption was applied, and then it requests some additional information to support the exemption, such as photos of the project area or any supporting environmental documents. So here we're going to take a short deviation from the environmental package just to talk about CEQA, since sections 2 and 3 are all of the CEQA components of the application, essentially. So as we go through this, just keep in mind any CEQA questions you have. We're going to try to address those before we get back to section 4 of the environmental package down the road. So just a quick crash course in CEQA documentation, if you aren't familiar. There's generally 4 types. Notices of exemption for exempt projects, initial study / negative declarations, initial study / mitigated negative declarations, and environmental impact reports. So there should be at least one of these documents submitted as part of the environmental package, and we're going to take a look at a few brief examples here. So starting with NOEs, a notice of exemption is short. Generally, it's like 1 to 2 pages. You can see a generic NOE template here on the right. And an NOE mainly identifies the project location and a description of the project, who the CEQA lead agency is, and the applicable CEQA exemption. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, next we're going to talk about initial studies, negative declarations, and mitigated negative declarations. So the template for an initial study comes from Appendix G of the CEQA guidelines. It's the main meat of these CEQA documents. So generally you will see the terms combined, for example, ISND or ISMND. The main thing to be aware of is you can't have a negative declaration or mitigated negative declaration without an initial study. It's the main component of the document. So here is an excerpt from Appendix G of the CEQA guidelines. This template starts with the basic project information, and then it goes through a series of different environmental resources using a checklist system. You can see the resource categories on the 3rd page over here on the right. For each resource category, there are a series of questions about the impacts of the project. So the project may have no impact, a less than significant impact, less than significant with mitigation, or a potentially significant impact. There's a few differences, but essentially the only difference between a negative declaration and a mitigated negative declaration is that a mitigated negative declaration has mitigation measures for 1 or more of these resource areas. If there's a potentially significant impact, then an environmental impact report or EIR is required. So that left column should never be selected for an initial study negative declaration or a mitigated negative declaration. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as just going down the checklist and marking things off though. So here's an example initial study mitigated negative declaration. This is just the air quality section. Here is the initial study checklist for air quality from Appendix G of the CEQA guidelines. But then note, a lot of things have been added below the checklist. So there's a background section here. A background, an environmental setting, or an environmental baseline is required. This is used as a baseline to determine the impacts of the project. And then further along, there is a discussion or analysis of the project impacts. So this will go through each of the checklist questions and explain the reasoning behind the level of impact. So here you can see that they are identifying for questions A, B, and C, the impacts are less than significant. Here is the rest of the air quality section from that example. You can see on the right side here that for question D of the initial study, the impacts are less than significant as well. Keep in mind, CEQA documents are formatted differently. So they might look a bit different depending on who developed them. So this is 3 other ISM&D examples basically. And here's the first page of the air quality section from each. You can see that a lot of documents will split the environmental background or baseline into regulatory information and like environmental information. So they'll list the applicable laws or regulations for the resource and then information about the environment at the project location. Generally, this type of information should be included for each environmental resource in the initial study checklist, regardless of the format. So it might look a bit different, but it should be in there. Okay, let's take a brief look at an EIR. There are different types of EIRs. Generally, they're for much larger projects or controversial projects. An EIR is a really in-depth environmental document. Generally, they are much longer than negative declarations or M&Ds. An EIR is required if there's a potentially significant impact, as I said earlier, but it's not the only reason an EIR might be prepared. This is an example from the city of Santa Cruz. Here's a couple pages from it, from the air quality section as well. This document provides just a much more in-depth discussion of the environmental impacts. But the basic idea is the same. They have the background environmental setting, and then there's an analysis of the impacts and any mitigation measures that are required for the project. EIRs have some other requirements over negative declarations and M&Ds for like public scoping, analysis of project alternatives, and that kind of thing, but I'm not going to go into detail on that here. So each type of CEQA process has various components. This is a list of the required documentation that needs to be submitted with the environmental package for each type of CEQA document. So this list is included in section 5 of the environmental package. We'll come back to it at the end of the presentation. Some of these documents may be included as part of the final draft of the CEQA document. It depends on the format. So for example, a lot of consultants and lead agencies will include comments and responses and the mitigation monitoring and reporting plan or program in the final CEQA document itself. So if you're putting together an environmental package to submit and you're not sure where a particular piece is, ask the environmental consultant or the lead agency. They should have all of these pieces somewhere. And a couple things that are like commonly left out of environmental packages are like comments and responses and the meeting minutes, and record of filing the notice of determination at either the local county clerk or the state clearinghouse. These are commonly left off when we go through and review a new application. Also, I wanted to note, I just saw there's a typo under the M&D and EIR sections. So the resolution/meeting minutes is a separate item from the MMRP. It should be on its own line. If you look at the negative declaration list here, that's the way it should look. So those are 2 different documents. Okay, I'm going to briefly talk about the state clearinghouse since it's key to the CEQA process for SRF projects. The Office of Planning and Research State Clearinghouse basically distributes CEQA documents to state agencies for review. For projects seeking funding, all CEQA documentation has to go through the State Clearinghouse. So at the top here is a link to their website. If you hover over clearinghouses on the top ribbon, you can select CEQA document submission, and this will give you details on how to submit CEQA documents to them. This is what the webpage looks like. And I want to note the requirement for online submissions starting November 3rd. So the State Clearinghouse is moving to an all online submissions process through their new CEQA submit portal. I recommend reading through their user guide and emailing them at the email address there if you have questions. You're going to need to register to submit CEQA documents through that CEQA submit portal. And this also means that consultants must prepare CEQA documents to meet web content accessibility guidelines. This is a new requirement now that we're going all digital with these documents. CEQA.net is the database for CEQA documents that are posted or circulated through the State Clearinghouse. They now upload CEQA documents to this database and they're available for download. So you can click on the advanced search at the top, and this will let you look up projects by the lead agency, document type, location, etc. So if you want to look at example documents, I would recommend going to this database and finding some here to download and take a look at. So the environmental section website that was linked on the second slide of this presentation also has some good basic CEQA resources. Click on basic CEQA information here in the middle, and you can find links to flowcharts of the CEQA process and that kind of thing if you are interested. Here are a few tips for streamlining the CEQA process. So the biggest thing, the biggest delays come from changes in the project scope after the CEQA document has been drafted. Try to make sure the project scope is as complete as possible before having the consultant move forward with the CEQA document. This isn't always possible, but just keep it in mind. If the scope changes, new surveys might be required, documents might need to be recirculated, or addendums might be needed. And all of this adds a lot to the time and budget required for a project. Communication, again, is key. Make sure that the environmental consultant has the information about the project that they need. Help the environmental consultant coordinate with the project engineer if necessary to get more information. And if other agencies are involved, start consulting early. Often delays are caused because we need another agency to weigh in on the project. And if we are consulting with another agency, please involve the State Water Board in meetings or discussions. We might need to discuss who the CEQA lead agency is or coordinate on federal requirements. And then here are a few reasons to coordinate with the State Water Board early on in the process. If the State Water Board is likely the CEQA lead agency, if there are questions about SRF requirements that may affect CEQA, or if there's uncertainty about a project being CEQA exempt, if any of these are the case, please reach out to us so that we can take a look at the project and help figure out the direction we need to go. Some things to keep in mind when setting the timeline for a project. CEQA documents have to be circulated for public comment. NOEs are only posted, so there's no public comment period, but it's 30 days for negative declarations and mitigated negative declarations, and 45 days for EIRs. So make sure there's time for this in the process. Don't plan for the draft CEQA document to be finished right at the end of the work plan, since there's this whole public comment period and response to comments that needs to happen before the consultant's job is complete. And this is a rough estimate, but a basic rule of thumb is assume about like 3 months will be needed after the draft CEQA document is ready for circulation through the state clearinghouse. There's also probably going to be time needed for the lead agency to adopt or certify the CEQA document. This depends on the lead agency's process for doing that. It could take a couple months if they need to add it as like a board agenda item or something. The CEQA process is not complete until the document is adopted and the lead agency files their notice of determination. Okay, when is the State Water Board the CEQA lead agency? Generally, when the applicant is a private water system and when no discretionary permits from a public agency are necessary for the project. Again, coordinate with us early if it looks like this is the case so that we can be involved in the process. The State Water Board has a couple responsibilities that we need to do. We need to do some tribal outreach for CEQA, and we will need to review the draft CEQA documents. Draft document review will probably take a couple weeks minimum, and it's just much easier to plan for this review if we know about the project in advance. When the State Water Board is CEQA lead agency, the consultant will need to draft the CEQA document if the project is not CEQA exempt, respond to any comments from State Water Board environmental staff, coordinate throughout the public review process, and respond to any comments received. So this slide basically shows what the consultant needs to prepare when the State Water Board is CEQA lead. Red is what the consultant is responsible for, and blue is what the State Water Board is responsible for. So blue items do not need to be a part of the TA work plan scope if the State Water Board is CEQA lead agency. So this will change what CEQA documents are submitted with the environmental package. No NOEs or NODs, no adoption resolution or meeting minutes, etc. Just work with us to determine the scope of work if the State Water Board is lead agency, basically. And here are a few tips for hiring CEQA consultants. Let's get the big thing out of the way first. Unfortunately, there are no specific like licensing or personnel requirements for CEQA consultants, but there are a few things you can look out for. they generally should have multiple staff. Since there's so many different focuses in a CEQA document, for example, like a biologist, an archaeologist, air quality analyst, all these types of personnel may be necessary in order to just draft a CEQA document. I don't think I've seen a really well-written CEQA document that was written by a single person, since there's just so many different types of resources in an initial study. You can ask for an example document to look at that's gone through the CEQA process. Consultants should be able to provide this, and it should contain the initial study components we discussed earlier, including the environmental baseline and an analysis for each checklist item. If they have a quote-unquote naked checklist with just the checkbox is marked off and no supporting analysis, then that's a red flag, basically. And then the last one, don't assume that because they've been writing CEQA documents for a long time, that means they're a qualified consultant. It could just mean that they've not worked on a project that has been challenged. So there's no CEQA police that review CEQA documents. Everything is decided by litigation. This means a consultant can really just fly under the radar with subpar CEQA documents if they've only worked on smaller, non-controversial projects. Okay, that was a lot of information. I wanted to pause here and see if there are any general CEQA questions that people have before we get back to the environmental package. Okay, I don't see any hands up, so I'm gonna move on. We can obviously, at the end of this presentation, answer any CEQA questions if something comes to mind or if there's something that would be helpful to know. All right, so here's our roadmap again. Now we're gonna go back to the environmental package to talk about federal crosscutters. So Section 4 of the environmental package is the largest section. It's 15 pages, and I think it has currently 19 federal environmental crosscutters that need to be filled out. We're not going to focus on every crosscutter since most will not apply to every project. If you have questions about a specific crosscutter, again, check the instructions at the beginning of the environmental package. It should point you in the right direction. There's a lot of links and guidance material that will help walk you through if the crosscutter is applicable to the project and what needs to be completed. So there's 4 main crosscutters for discussion today. These are the pages that they're on highlighted, and here they are. So the Environmental Alternative Analysis, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the National Historic Preservation Act. We're talking about these 4 crosscutters because they apply to most projects and they require the most work from environmental consultants. These all require some documentation to be drafted and submitted. So first up is the Environmental Alternative Analysis. The top here is the Environmental Alternative Analysis excerpt from Section 4 of the environmental package, and then the bottom are the instructions, which are on page 4 of the environmental package. So the main thing to be aware of here is the Environmental Alternative Analysis must analyze the environmental impacts of the project alternatives. This is not covered by default in most engineering reports. So a lot of times when we are reviewing the package, we'll get to this section and we're referred to the engineering report. And when we go look at the engineering report, it doesn't have any environmental analysis for the alternatives. The environmental alternative analysis will often need to be requested from the environmental consultant specifically. And then just a note, the environmental alternative analysis is not required if a project is CEQA exempt. So here is an excerpt from an environmental alternative analysis. You can see they've got the alternatives identified, including no action, which is one of the requirements in the instructions. And then there's an analysis of the environmental impacts of the alternatives. In this case, it's arranged by resource categories, like an initial study. There's no format requirements for this document. Other formats are totally fine, but this example seemed good because it seems like an effective way to present the analysis. And again, check the instructions on page 4 for the explicit requirements. So moving on to the Clean Air Act. This is a general note for all the crosscutter sections. So the first link for a given crosscutter generally provides background information on what the crosscutter is. So the link after Clean Air Act in the top left there goes to the EPA's website summarizing the act and its history. So the first requirement for this crosscutter is to identify the project's air basin and local air district. You just use the links here to find this information. And then the important part of this crosscutter is we need this table completed. This table requires the project air emissions to be calculated. There's a link to CaliMod above the table. CaliMod is a program used to estimate air emissions for project construction and operation. There are other models available, and those are okay to use, but modeling air emissions requires some things to be known about construction activity, like an estimate of the number of trucks or vehicles that will be needed. So in the example initial study that we looked at earlier, they had calculated the project emissions and included them in the air quality section of the CEQA document. The two columns here on the right are for the emissions from project construction and operation. And then over here on the right-hand side of the slide is the second part of this crosscutter, which is asking about general conformity determinations. Most SRF projects, I'll say, will not be subject to a general conformity determination. This will be because the emissions for the project are below the federal de minimis levels. So if a consultant has calculated the project emissions, but you need to fill in the attainment status, which is the first two columns in this table, follow this link here on the right for California's current non-attainment counties. You'll need to look up the project location and then just fill in the correct info. This link is also on our environmental section website that I showed at the beginning of the presentation. Thresholds of significance for the project air basin here in the middle of the table come from the local air district. All of their websites are different. You can either dig through their website looking for the information, but I really think the easiest way to get this is to just contact them and ask, either email or call them. And then for the second part of this crosscutter, you need to figure out if the project is subject to a general conformity determination. So if it's located in an area that is attainment or unclassified for all federal criteria pollutants, or the project emissions are below the federal de minimis levels, the answer here will be no. Here's a link at the bottom to the de minimis tables. You can compare the project emissions to these levels. As I mentioned, I think at least for drinking water, most drinking water SRF projects are well below these thresholds. And so the answer to this question is no. Moving on to the Endangered Species Act. Here's the environmental package excerpt. The main thing to be aware of here is the requirement for a biological report to meet Endangered Species Act Section 7 requirements. This link here has guidance for preparing a bio report to meet those requirements. If you click on that link, it takes you to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website. And here in the middle is the report preparation guidance. This is a great resource. It explains what needs to be included in the bio report. This may be helpful to send to biological consultants. I think most consultants that write bio reports should be aware of these requirements, but it can be a helpful reminder. This guidance is also linked directly in the Endangered Species Act instructions section at the beginning of the environmental package. And I would recommend having the consultant read those instructions as well. They're on pages 7 and 8 of the environmental package. The instructions here go into some more detail about a few specifics for the bio report that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service guidelines do not, like the need for official species lists to be included and for a potential to occur table to be included. And a note on hiring consultants to prepare a bio report. If you read through our guidance material, you will often see the term qualified biologist. So unfortunately, like with CEQA documents, there aren't specific certifications or like requirements for a biological consultant, but generally they should have a related degree and they should have experience writing bio reports as well. So you can always ask if they've written biological reports to meet Section 7 ESA requirements previously. and you can ask for an example. Okay, time for the National Historic Preservation Act. So here's the environmental package section. The main thing to be aware of here is the requirement for a historic properties identification report or a cultural report to meet National Historic Preservation Act Section 106 requirements. So there's a few resources for this cultural report requirement. The link at the bottom of this paragraph will take you to the Office of Historic Preservation guidance document. This has some helpful information. However, this guidance is directed more at the federal agencies who are responsible for consulting with the Office of Historic Preservation. So it just includes some things that a consultant would not be responsible for providing. So the best guidance for a cultural report and for preparing them to meet our requirements is on our website. So you click on either program link here on the left side, and then click on the Cultural Resources Report Preparation link. This guidelines document is the best resource for preparing a cultural report to meet our requirements. It's meant specifically for applicants and consultants. It's a 6-page document. It covers things to consider before hiring a cultural resources consultant. It goes over professional qualifications for a cultural consultant. And good news, for once, there are specific requirements this time. The consultant must meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for professional qualifications. For an archaeologist, this generally requires a graduate degree, and then there's certain requirements for time and experience in archaeological research, I think field experience, and there's a few other requirements. And an important note, if there's a building or structure within the area of potential effects for the project that is 50 years of age or older, it must be evaluated by a qualified architectural historian. Most archaeologists are not qualified to evaluate buildings. So this can cause huge issues if a cultural report has already been drafted, because it requires going out and hiring the correct consultant and basically starting from scratch with the cultural report in some ways. This guidance document also covers content requirements for the cultural report, of course, such as a description of the area of potential effects, or APE. To properly define the APE, we need a really well-defined project description, because we need to know not only the area the project's going to take place in, but also how high or how deep project components will go. And it also lists the requirements for Native American outreach. Native American outreach has to identify Section 106 for these reports. Oftentimes letters are sent to tribes, but they only identify CEQA, and that's not sufficient. There's a section on precautions and common issues, which come up a lot in cultural reports. And then a note on confidentiality. So cultural reports may contain confidential information. Treat all cultural reports as if they are confidential. Don't upload them through our FAST portal. Email or mail them directly to the Environmental Review Unit. And just please provide this guidance document to the cultural resources consultant. It's really, really common for cultural reports to be missing multiple requirements that are very clearly outlined in this document. Here is a reminder of the State Water Board cultural contacts. I will note the guidance document on the previous page does have an incorrect contact, I think, for Johanna Marty, who no longer works at the State Water Board. So these are the two you want to contact. If there are questions about cultural reports or procedures, please contact us. You're welcome to contact Wendy or Lisa directly, or to contact an environmental scientist to put you in touch with them. Again, it's just much easier to respond to questions early than having to redo a cultural report after we thought it was finished. So those were the main crosscutters. Now we're gonna wrap up with section 5, which is attachments. So section 5 of the environmental package is a list of potential and required attachments. It's divided between CEQA documents and federal crosscutter documents. So on the left-hand side here, you can see the checklist for CEQA documents that we went over earlier. And on the right-hand side, here are the 4 federal crosscutters that we discussed. Note that there's one required attachment that we did not talk about, and that's the official floodplain map. So here's the floodplain management crosscutter section that requests the floodplain map in section 4 of the environmental package. An official floodplain map is often not included in any of the other documents that we've talked about, so consultants often won't prepare them unless they're tasked with completing the environmental package itself. Getting a floodplain map is pretty straightforward, however. You can just go to the FEMA link under required documents paragraph right here. And this will take you to the FEMA Flood Map Service Center. You search for the project location in the box here, and you can adjust the map centered on the project location, and then click on Dynamic Map in the center of the page. This will produce a map that you can download and attach to the environmental package. Check the key on the right-hand side to determine if the project location is within a 100-year floodplain, and then answer the questions in the environmental package. It's pretty straightforward. So those are the main attachments for most projects. Most of the crosscutter attachments are marked if applicable. Check the crosscutter sections and the instructions in the environmental package to see if they're required for a specific project. I generally find it easier if the attachments are submitted separately for review, just in case revisions are needed to a certain document. Otherwise, we wind up with certain documents being combined in the same PDF with outdated versions of other documents, and it can be a bit difficult to just keep track of everything and what's most up to date. And a final note on CEQA exemptions and federal crosscutters. So there's this note at the bottom on the right. Several crosscutters, including the ones we discussed, have this note and basically saying if the project is CEQA exempt, the documents may not be required. The environmental alternative analysis is the only crosscutter that is directly related to CEQA exemptions right now. So if a project is exempt from CEQA, the environmental alternative analysis is not required. If there's a limited amount of groundbreaking activity, contact the environmental review unit to discuss the need for bio and cultural reports. Generally, if there is groundbreaking activity of any kind, a cultural report will most likely be required. There's a little bit more leeway with bio reports. In some cases, we just need enough information to support a no effect finding for Section 7 rather than a full report, but it depends on the project. And finally, if there are limited construction and operation air emissions, either do your best to provide estimates in the air quality table or contact the local air district to confirm compliance. And then what if crosscutters do not apply? Some projects may not require environmental crosscutters. This would need to be confirmed with the grant manager and or the project manager at the State Water Board. If this is the case, Section 4 of the environmental package does not need to be completed. It can just be left blank. And no federal crosscutter documents for Section 4 are necessary. So this includes the bio and cultural reports and the air quality analysis, but I'm putting a giant asterisk on the end of the statement. And that's because these reports, bio, cultural, the air quality analysis, they may still be necessary in order to support the CEQA document. So they might be missing or not require some specific federal language. They might have less strict format requirements, but for the majority of projects, these studies should be conducted in order to adequately support the initial study. So for example, if the State Water Board is CEQA lead agency, we are most likely going to request these reports in support of the CEQA document. Here are just a few more resources you can check out if you would like. All of these, again, are linked from the environmental section website. That's kind of the hub for all of our State Water Board resources about environmental requirements. And here are the contacts that we've gone over in this presentation. I'm always happy to help answer questions, but feel free to reach out to Bridget or Brian with general questions as well. Again, Wendy and Lisa are the contacts for cultural questions. And just one last reminder, if you're asking questions about a specific project, please either reach out through your grant manager or at a minimum CC them on email so they're kept in the loop. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you all for your time. And I think we will open this up for questions now. So I'm going to turn this back over to Ibian.
Thanks, Gabriel. So if you have a question, again, please raise your hand. You can do so by scrolling down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, and there's a link that says participants. That will open a participant screen to your right side. And at the bottom of that participant screen, there's an icon that says raise hand. We have a question. I'm going to unmute you, Tim.
This is Tim Crow. My question relates to how it is determined if a biological or cultural report is not needed for the crosscutters.
Good question. So I'm assuming you're talking about like if federal crosscutters apply, but if there's a case where like the crosscutters apply and a biocultural report may not be required.
Yeah, specifically, if we had a de minimis amount of excavation and earthwork, and we feel that it would not require a cultural resource analysis or a biological analysis, how do we make that determination before submitting the package?
Got it. Okay, so there's a couple pieces to this. The cultural one is a little bit more clear cut, so I'm going to tackle that first. Basically, in order to meet National Historic Preservation Act Section 106 requirements, we need a cultural report if there is potential to disturb like cultural resources. So there's a series of like determinations for Section 106 or like Section 106 findings.
Right.
Basically, any project that has groundbreaking activity, even if you do research and you go, okay, there's nothing in the project area that we know of, and so we don't think there's going to be cultural resources that we're impacting. Because there is groundbreaking activity, that type of activity is the type that could cause an impact, even if you like just know that there's nothing there. And so because of that, we need a cultural report anyway. It's in, I would check the guidance document that I linked for a better explanation of this, but basically a cultural report is required based on the type of project, not the potential impacts of that project, is a kind of weird way to say it.
Okay.
So basically, like the rule of thumb I go by is if there is groundbreaking, we're going to need a cultural report. There's even a few cases where there is no groundbreaking and we might still need it. An example I can think of is if the project will require like a radio antenna to be installed and it's going to be installed on an existing structure. There's no groundbreaking there. We're just going to, attach this to the roof. If that structure is old, if it's 50 years of age or older, then it might have to be evaluated because that can still have an impact on a cultural resource. So if there's groundbreaking, cultural report is basically required. If there's something that really seems on the edge there, that's where I would get in touch with us early and we can have Wendy or Lisa take a look at it and see exactly what we would need.
Okay.
For bio reports, we have a little bit more leeway. Basically, we're going to need something to support a no effect finding for Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. So if there's a project that's in like a completely disturbed area and we're having like a minimum amount of groundbreaking and there's no habitat or anything there, it's possible we wouldn't need a full bio report. Again, that's a situation where you would probably need to get in touch with us so that we can review the project and figure out exactly what we need to support that determination. Basically, we have to support that determination so that when we get audited by EPA, we can show that, yeah, like this project doesn't have potential to impact biological resources. Maybe we'll do a record search and stuff and show, this whole project has been paved over. There's no biological resources here, but just something to support that determination. But it might be less than having like a full bio report that requires, like a field survey and all this type of stuff.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
So we have one question that came in, and the question was whether this training is being recorded. And so the answer is yes. We are recording all of the trainings, and we will make them available in the near future online, and we'll send out a follow-up email with a link on where to find those trainings. Thanks. Okay, can give folks a couple minutes to think about any questions they may have. Remember, raise your hand if you want to ask a question or send us an email. We can ask your question and answer it as well. Okay, so it looks like we do not have any questions in the queue nor in our inbox. So at this time, I want to thank Gabriel and open it up to Kim or Dat if they would like to say a few words.
Okay, thank you so much, Gabriel, for doing the presentation. I think it's extremely helpful. I don't know about all of you, but I know I'm looking to see where do I find the button to raise my hand. So I'm not sure if that's the case for everybody out there. I just don't see it in my menu option here. It could just be me. So I just want to put it out there that I don't know if anybody have a question and not able to raise their hand like me. Anyway, but we are here to, I know we finished a bit early, so we have time to take question. Gabriel could answer any question you may have, but I want to take the opportunity to thank the staff, Kim, Abian, and especially, our presenter, Gabriel, for taking the time out and present this valuable information to us. So thank you, and Kim.
Yes.
Take it off.
Thank you, Dad. And it was you. We went through that raise hand at the beginning of the session. But anyway, thanks everyone for participating in this training. I know it's long overdue. But I am very appreciate your time, taking your time to learn how to submit a complete environmental package, or in the future any other kind of funding packages. And thanks Gabriel and Bridget Benning for providing this training. It's helpful not just to TA providers, but for our internal staff as well. And just like I mentioned, for those who did not participate the training that we had last week on the clean water application, we are having an environmental training specifically to your subcontractors, environmental firms. That one is coming in September. So I think that Ibian sent out the flyer a day or two ago. So just gonna keep that in mind and invite your subs to attend the training. So they can hear directly from us of our expectations on the documentations that they provide. So with that, I'm gonna turn it back to Ibian.
Thanks, Kim. All right, so again, thanks, Kim and Dat. Thanks, Gabriel, for the thorough training on the environmental package. I feel like I actually understand a little bit more about what's required and what you look for in terms of our environmental review units. So 2 announcements. Kim has covered one of them. I did send out an email to all the TA providers on, I think it was maybe Wednesday or Tuesday, about a training that's geared towards the consultants. So if you can, please share that information. All RSVP should come to me. The training date is Tuesday, September 22nd. The second announcement we have is the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund application training is rescheduled to Wednesday, 9:30. So September 30th. Thanks again for attending today's training. We appreciate your time. If you have any additional questions, please direct them to Ibian, ibyang.rivera@waterboards.ca.gov, or to the grant manager assigned to your provider. I do want to also note that we are sending a follow-up email after each training with an evaluation form, the meeting materials again, in case you missed it or lost that email. and also any updates that we have in terms of the training series. And we appreciate your time, and thank you, everybody. Bye.